Draco Malfoy and the Dark Lord's Diary. My Draco will hear about this. Chapter 6. Something Stronger Than Hate and Fear. The morning of the Quidditch match Gryffindor vs. Hufflepuff was weirdly blurry for Draco. He had woken up feeling like his mind was on standby. He could remember going down for breakfast, but not having arrived there. The next thing he knew, Draco found himself on his way to the Quidditch pitch. He held in, drowsy and disoriented, taking a look around. He was alone on the path out to the field, and he could hear loud voices from the stands, but no players were yet up in the air. Draco frowned, trying to remember why he was out here alone and why he hadn't gone down to the match with Hermione and Weasley. Then he suddenly spotted 3 people hurrying up the path, moving in his direction. It took him a moment to recognize them for who they were. Professor McGonagall was hurrying ahead of the little group, looking tense and distraught. Behind her, 2 Gryffindor students were following, one in normal school robes and one in Quidditch gear. Draco froze, staring at Harry and Weasley uncomprehendingly. Behind them, more and more students were making their way back to the castle, but Draco paid them no mind. "Mr. Malfoy!" Professor McGonagall's voice broke through his daze, and Draco looked up to meet his teacher's serene expression. "Good that you're here. You'd better come along too." "Come where?" Draco asked in confusion, but she just shook her head and pushed on. Harry caught his eyes, and his expression showed an equal lack of comprehension, along with fear. Silently, Draco fell into step with them, hurrying after McGonagall. "What's going on?" he whispered to Harry. "Has the match been cancelled?" "Yes," Harry breathed, staring worriedly at McGonagall's back, as if the explanation for this turn of events was sewn into the back of her robes. "Where were you?" Weasley demanded when Harry said no more. "And when you ran off to the library, and you don't turn up either. What have the 2 of you been up to?" Draco began but broke off, frowning. He tried hard to remember, but he came up with nothing, and his panic rose with every passing second. The last time he had not been able to remember what he had been doing mere minutes beforehand, he had attacked Finch Fletchley and nearly Headless Nick. He was saved from answering, though, as they entered the castle, and soon they found themselves in front of the hospital wing. "This will be a bit of a shock," McGonagall told them in a voice so gentle that it made Draco's blood freeze in his veins. "There has been another attack. Another double attack." Draco could not breathe as she pushed open the door, revealing Madame Pomfrey, who was tending to 2 rigid figures on adjacent beds. One was an older Ravenclaw girl with long curly hair that Draco did not know. The other one was Hermione. He knew that Professor McGonagall was talking, but he could not hear a thing. All that registered in his mind was white noise. Snape came down to their common room that night to announce the newly instated rules following the attacks on Hermione and the other girl, whose name was Penelope Clearwater. The new curfew for all students had been moved up to 6 p.m., and no one was to leave their common room after that time. The teachers were to escort each class to their classrooms, as well as the bathroom and the Great Hall. All club activities had been put on hold. Snape also fixed them with sharp eyes as he demanded that any student with information on the attacks should come forward, for if the culprit wasn't caught soon, the school would have to be closed. The mood among the Slytherins following those announcements was a lot duller than it had been past the previous attacks. It was obvious that the threat of closing Hogwarts alerted them to the seriousness of the situation. They sat in groups after Snape had left, whispering amongst each other. Draco made his way back to the dormitory in a daze. Thankfully, it was deserted, and no one was there to taunt him as he let himself fall onto the mattress, staring into empty space. He had attacked Hermione, one of the 2 true friends he had. Hermione, who had spent the last couple of months worrying about him, not once suspecting that she had any danger to expect of him. Draco's eyes stung. Weasley had been right. He was exactly as bad as his father. No, he was worse, for he had never even owned up to what he was, convinced that he was worthy of being friends with someone like Harry and Hermione, and determined on choosing the opposite side. And yet here he was, keeping vital information from the teaching staff to save his own skin, and attacking his friends, instead of just acting. He pulled his knees up on the mattress and pressed his face to them, stifling the desperate sobs that tore from his mouth. The next day, the news that Dumbledore had been suspended as headmaster and that Hagrid had been taken to Azkaban traveled the school. Draco did not understand how anyone could suspect Hagrid. Hagrid was as far from the heir of Slytherin as one could be, with what he was pretty sure was giant blood of some degree in his veins and his kind, cheerful character. People were whispering about him having been involved in the first set of attacks 50 years ago, leading to his expulsion as a student. And now, so they mused, he had decided to continue the work he had left off back then. But Draco did not listen to any of it, knowing firsthand that it was not true. The Dark Lord had opened the chamber 50 years ago, having framed Hagrid for all Draco could guess, or maybe he had used him just like he was now using Draco. Draco wished he had known of Hagrid's past involvement earlier, so he could have approached the man about it. Maybe together they could have figured it out. Now, though, it was too late to think about it. Draco knew that he had no choice but to tell someone. Hagrid was innocent, and he could not let him remain in Azkaban, when really Draco was the one who should be there. But who to tell? Dumbledore was gone. Draco had clung to the hope that the influential headmaster would understand, and would believe his words as one of Harry's friends. But now that was not an option anymore. Of course, he could approach McGonagall, who had been installed as temporary headmistress, and who he had tried to approach shortly before his attack on Finch Fletchley. But would the head of Gryffindor House be invested enough to save him from possible incarceration, or would her word even hold enough power to do so? Draco tried to linger after various transfiguration lessons, working up the courage to ask her for a private audience. But she was always brisk about leading them towards their next class, and every time Draco lost his nerves. Draco had not spoken more than a couple of words to Harry since the attack on Hermione. They had no opportunity to see each other between classes, and they only shared potions. But even as they sat next to each other, Draco refused to meet his gaze. He knew that Harry was watching him more often than not, but he could not bring himself to look up at him, knowing he would break down if he did. When Harry tried to start a conversation, they were always interrupted by Snape, and Draco found himself almost thankful for it because he did not know what to say to his friend. This went on for 2 weeks, and day after day Draco felt more disgusted with himself. It was when the news spread that the mandrakes were ready for cutting that he finally forced himself to open the chest. The one that Hagrid had given to him, he remembered, his heart clenching painfully at the realization, and withdrew the leather-bound diary. He did not care anymore, he told himself. The first teacher he found, he was going to approach and hand himself over. Draco could feel the dark magic emanating from the diary envelop him, and then everything went black. When Draco awoke, he was lying on his back, staring up at a high, dark stone ceiling he did not recall seeing before. The ground he was lying on was stone too, and he was soaked to the bones with ice-cold water. With a violent shiver, he realized how much he was freezing. He tried to remember how he had gotten here, but came up blank. Then a gasp cut through the silence, alerting him that he was not alone. "Draco!" Harry was at his side a moment later, looking battered and terrified. His clothes were wet too, and appeared to be torn in some places. Dirt clung to his sweaty face, and his green eyes were too bright as they roamed over Draco's face. "Can you hear me? Are you hurt?" Draco breathed, making an attempt to sit. Harry's hands flew out to help him, and they were shockingly warm against the coldness that was enveloping him. "What happened?" Shakily he looked around. A long, cavernous, dark chamber stretched out behind them, encased by statues of stone serpents along the walls. At the end of it, right where they were sitting, was another taller statue of a face Draco did remember seeing before. It took a moment for the dots to connect. Salazar Slytherin. The Chamber of Secrets! Without his input, his eyes traveled to a dark shape lying not far from them. Draco had just a moment to take in the incredible size and the bright green color before he screamed. His voice was echoed by the startling screeching sound of a phoenix who took flight at the noise. Draco tried to crawl backwards away from all of it, but Harry had grabbed his shoulders and was holding on to him. "The basilisk is dead, Draco," he called. "It can't hurt you, it's dead." "Dead?" Draco repeated, breathing hard. "A basilisk? But how—" "I killed it." Harry cut him off matter-of-factly. "And I stabbed the diary too. You're safe now, Draco, trust me." "The diary?" Draco muttered, and finally he spotted the leather-bound notebook lying on the ground a few feet away from them, within a puddle of ink. There was a large hole in it, and a big tooth lay next to it. "Oh, Merlin!" His vision blurred. It took him a moment to realize it was from his own tears. "Draco," Harry whispered soothingly. The phoenix landed almost noiselessly on Draco's other side, observing him curiously. I did not mean to, Harry," Draco got out, but it was hard to speak. He was trembling violently now, and sobs racked through his chest. "I tried to stop it, I swear." "I know," Harry assured him, and then Draco found himself enveloped in an embrace. Draco closed his eyes, willing himself to calm down, but it was no use. All the fear, the guilt, the desperation of the last few months poured out of him in the form of tears and broken sobs, and Harry's physical comfort only made it worse. "Please don't hate me," Draco whimpered, and his voice sounded small and lost. Harry's arms tightened around him. "Of course I don't hate you," he insisted. "You were possessed, Draco. Voldemort, he made you do all this stuff. Ginny, when you were taken to the chamber, she approached Ron and me. She was crying and telling us about that diary she had found among her books after our trip to Diagon Alley during the summer holidays, and how it had written back to her every time she wrote in it. She told us that there had been lags in her memory after she started using it, and that when the attacks on Miss Norris and Colin happened, she had not known what she had been doing when all that happened. And then the diary was gone on the day after that second attack. She thought she lost it, and afraid as she was, she didn't tell anyone about it. But when you were taken earlier today, she wondered if maybe you had gotten your fingers on it, and the same thing had happened to you." "My father gave it to her," Draco brought out through his tears. Every word burned in his chest. "Dobby, it works for my family, and when you mentioned his name, I called on him." Draco took a shaky breath. "He told me—" But he could not continue, and Harry nodded quickly. He could feel the movement against his shoulder. "I understand," Harry said gently. "You took the diary from Ginny to protect her." There was a moment of silence before he asked tentatively, "Why did you not just tell us, Draco?" "I couldn't," Draco whispered. "After everything Weasley said about me and my father, I... "Draco," Harry whispered, and then he pulled away to catch his gaze. "Draco, look at me." Harry's eyes were blazing with intensity as Draco's lids fluttered open, and he couldn't breathe. He felt like he was burning under Harry's attention. "I will never," Harry stressed the word harshly, "ever think that you are like your father, no matter what happens. I know you better than that." If possible, Draco cried even harder at those words. "But Weasley—" "Ron didn't really mean it either," Harry interrupted him. "It was a stupid thing to say, and I'll have a word with him about it, believe me. But when you were taking, he was just as scared as me. He came down here with me, actually, but he got stuck on the way with Lockhart. We'll have to go back soon. I bet he's worried sick." When Draco did not answer, he pulled him back into their prior embrace. "You scared me so much," Harry whispered. "I thought you were dead." "How did you find me?" Draco spoke against the material of Harry's robes, his face buried against the other boy's shoulder, but it seemed the Gryffindor could understand him anyway. "Hermione," Harry explained. "We found a note. Shortly before the attack on her, she had figured out that the monster inside the chamber was a basilisk, and that it was moving through the plumbing of the school. When you were taken, we connected the dots to Moaning Myrtle and her bathroom. She died 50 years ago in that very same bathroom, you see. It was the attack Hagrid got expelled for, even though he was never involved. And, well, we wanted to tell Lockhart because he said he was going to try getting to you, but, he's a bloody coward, and a liar, for that matter. But never mind that now. We came ourselves in the end." Draco clung to Harry, taking deep breaths to rein in his tears. "I'm so sorry, Harry," he breathed. "I was so scared to say anything, that's why I tried to figure out where the chamber was for myself, so that I could hand over all the information to Dumbledore and proof that I wasn't involved. But I couldn't, I didn't find out a bloody thing, and then—" "And then he possessed you too." Harry nodded, hugging him a little tighter. "I should have known. All these months you've looked horrible, and I never—" "How could you have known?" Draco demanded, finally pulling away from Harry to wipe at his cheeks in angry motions. "When I tried with all my might to hide it! I was so stupid!" "You kinda were," Harry agreed, and the words stung, but when Draco looked up at him, he was smiling gently. "But it was our fault too, in a way. I know you never meant to hurt anyone. Just promise me that from now on, no matter what, you will always tell me the truth." Draco blinked, fighting against the last couple of tears dreading to fall from his eyes, and nodded once. Harry nodded too, and then he got to his feet. He held out a hand to help Draco up. "Right then," Harry announced. "Let's go back." They came across Weasley and Lockhart a few minutes after they had left the chamber, making their way through a dark, damp tunnel that Draco realized he must have walked through to get here in the first place, but could not recall. Harry called out to Weasley when the sound of shifting rocks reached them and pulled Draco along to where the ceiling of the tunnel had apparently collapsed around them, leaving a path of destruction blocking their path. There was, though, a hole in the blockade of fallen rocks, just large enough for him and Harry to slip through individually. Weasley was waiting for them on the other side, looking relieved and pale. "Thank Merlin," he muttered as he caught sight of the two of them. He reached out a hand to help Draco through the hole he had created, and Draco, very much beside himself, took it without a word. "Malfoy, you bloody idiot!" Weasley burst out as soon as Draco had made it to the other side. "You scared us to death, mate! Don't you ever—" "Ron," Harry said sharply, throwing him a meaningful look as he climbed through the hole after Draco. "Drop it, will you?" Weasley flushed at that, sufficiently abashed as he muttered, "Well, I'm glad you're all right. Both of you." He frowned in confusion when the phoenix followed after Harry, a lump of cloth grasped in its claws. The Draco had no focus to identify. "He's Dumbledore's," Harry said offhandedly, making Draco aware of all the plot twists he had neglected to ask about. "Is that a sword?" Weasley demanded, staring at Harry incredulously, and only then did Draco notice that his friend was carrying a silver, jewel-studded sword, as well as the stabbed diary. "Later on," he brushed the other Gryffindor off. "For now, let's just get out of here. Where's Lockhart?" "Back there," Weasley replied, nodding further down the tunnel, suddenly strangely cheerful. "He's in a bad way. Come and see." Lockhart, Weasley explained, had tried to hit them with a memory charm in an attempt to get rid of them on the way to the chamber, but having used Weasley's broken wand, the spell had backfired, causing the loss of his own memory instead, and indeed Lockhart seemed unable to recall who they were, where they were, or who he was, for that matter. Absently, Draco noted that he liked him remarkably better for all of it. Fawkes, Dumbledore's phoenix, with the incredible strength his kind was famous for, ended up lifting them all the way towards the second-floor girls' bathroom, where moaning Myrtle waited for them, faintly disappointed that they were still alive. They did not linger, though. Instead, after a short moment of consideration, they made their way to McGonagall's office, who, as deputy headmistress in Dumbledore's absence, was supposedly the best authority to seek out. The office was crowded when they were called inside. McGonagall was standing by her desk, where she had been conversing with none other than Dumbledore himself until their sudden appearance, and at the fireplace sat Snape, opposite Draco's rigid-looking parents, Dobby at their side. The shocked silence was suppressive for a moment, and then Draco's mother jumped up and crossed the room to pull him into a breathtakingly tight embrace. "Darling," she whispered. "Oh, by Merlin, are you all right? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Mother," Draco breathed, though the way he trembled under her attention belied his true feelings. "Potter? Weasley?" McGonagall spoke up weakly, directing her attention towards the students of her house. "Could you please be so kind to explain?" Harry hesitated before crossing the room toward McGonagall's desk, dropping down the dirty bundle Fawkes had carried earlier. The sorting hat, Draco realized with a start, the stabbed diary, and the sword. Then he faced Dumbledore and dove into the story of how they had found the entrance to the Chamber of Secrets, and how he had found Draco there, and with the help of Fawkes, who had procured him with the sorting hat, and consequently the Sword of Gryffindor, had fought the basilisk and killed it. Draco noted that he was consciously refraining from any mention of Draco's involvement. It was Dumbledore, though, who cut in with a gentle smile, inquiring,
What interests me most is how Lord Voldemort managed to enchant Draco when my sources tell me he is currently in hiding in the forest of Albania."
Draco's mother, who was still holding on to him, even as she had turned to Harry to follow his story, gasped in horror, her arms tightening around her son. "What is the meaning of this?" she asked, turning to Draco, her face a mixture of both shock and fear. "Draco?" Harry stayed silent, catching Draco's eyes, and with a deep breath and a trembling voice, the Slytherin finally spoke. "Maybe we should ask Father about that," he announced, drawing strength from his resentment, "since he was the one who handed the diary to Jennifer Weasley this summer." A tense silence followed his words, and Draco's eyes found his father's at last. He was still standing near the fireplace, his posture stiff and his jaw clenched. He looked pale and faint, but his eyes were flashing dangerously at Draco. "What exactly are you saying, Draco?" he asked, his tone controlled, despite the anger Draco could feel emanating from him. "Dobby told me what you did after the second attack," Draco muttered. Dobby whimpered at his words, but Draco ignored him. "And he helped me get the diary back from Ginny. Since then, I have been trying to get information from it, to find out where the chamber was so I could tell someone, but—" He cut himself off with a shaky breath, looking up at his mother, who was staring at him, clearly horrified, and then into the clear blue eyes of Dumbledore. "I never meant to hurt anyone," he breathed urgently. "I only wanted—"
"Of course you didn't,"
Dumbledore reassured him, his voice kind and understanding.
"I never once suspected that you did, Draco. Older and wiser wizards than you have been hoodwinked by Lord Voldemort. I do not blame you."
Draco felt weak in the knees, so relieved was he to hear Dumbledore's words. His mother pulled him into another embrace, and Draco heard her mutter a sound of despair into his hair.
"So,"
Draco murmured, picking the diary up from McGonagall's desk and observing it carefully.
"would you like to explain to me what exactly this diary is, Lucius?"
"I have no idea," Draco's father responded politely, "for I have never seen it before."
"Voldemort wrote in it when he was 16.
Harry offered, glaring fiercely at Draco's father before meeting Dumbledore's gaze.
"He told me he preserved a part of himself inside of it. When first Ginny and then Draco wrote into it, they allowed him to possess them. He made them open the chamber for him and released the basilisk into the school." "I see,"
Dumbledore nodded, staring at the diary in his hand.
"Brilliant. Of course he was probably the most brilliant student Hogwarts has ever seen."
There was a moment of silence before he dropped the diary back on the desk and faced the rest of the room.
"Mr. Malfoy should go up to the hospital wing straight away,"
he announced.
"This has been a terrible ordeal for him. There will be no punishment, bed rest, and perhaps a large steaming mug of hot chocolate. I always find that cheers me up."
He smiled at Draco.
"You will find Madame Pomfrey is still awake. She's just giving up magic juice. I dare say the basilisk's victims will be waking up any moment."
"So Hermione's okay?" Weasley called in relief.
"There has been no lasting harm done,"
Dumbledore assured them.
"Narcissa, may I ask you to accompany your son? I want to have a word with your husband. You too, Mr. Potter, Mr. Weasley."
Draco's mother straightened herself, nodding at the headmaster. Draco caught Harry's eyes for a moment, but the other boy just smiled at him encouragingly before his mother led him out of the room.